Hello.
Morning.
Morning. How are you?
You know, I'm pretty good compared to what I have been.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I had a lot of mornings are always the worst with head cold kind of things.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty happy that today I know my voice might sound a little bit weird, but I don't feel as bad, and I don't feel just stuff in my nose and everything ugh. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
How are you?
Oh, pretty good. So we got the CSV conference. We got that abstract accepted.
Yes.
We got the email yesterday. So let's see. Why don't we start with that? I'll wait for other people to come in, but let me present now. So this is the proposal here. Okay, you can see my screen right now. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So this is a proposal we submitted. Epistemological directories for research, development, and education. And that's Ankit. Hello, Ankit. We're just talking about one of the abstracts that got accepted, the CSV comp, which is this one here. So this is Jesse and myself, and we talk about epistemological directories, which is a sort of a catch-all term for the frontier maps that Jesse's been working on, but also a couple, maybe like thinking of it more broadly. So we have, so I want to point this out to Jesse because now what we have to do with this abstract is turn it into a talk. And they haven't given the details about the talk yet. So we have to wait on that. But I did want to look through last year's conference. So this is last year's conference. And this had some talks. I don't know if they'll have it in the same format, but if you look at some of these talks, they kind of give you an idea. So this one's frictionless data processing in the wild. I guess they record the talk as well. So the slides look, they host their slides on Zenodo. And I was looking over these slides, and they look very, they seem to be very sparse in terms of text, and they have a lot of visual elements to them. So that's one thing I noticed about this conference. So the title, okay, this is maybe not as sparse as I thought, but this is a diagram here of the organization, and then they get into some details about their platform, and then they talk about fair standards of data, which is technical detail, and they give some information about that. So I think these are 30 minutes long, and so it may be 30 minutes, and maybe less, but that's basically what we have to shoot for. It's a lot of, it's 44 slides, which are probably a good guideline is one slide per minute, but that's, I don't know if that's something that we need to adhere to, just as long as it times out to around 25 to 30 minutes. So it's going to be a challenge to come up with all the slides. I would think we could talk about it in the next couple sessions to kind of outline what we need to cover in the slides. One thing would be some sort of diagram of the various ideas and components in these directories. So what's involved? What kinds of things can you put in there? Maybe a big picture vision might be one slide or two slides, and then the diagram of the component parts, we could walk through those, and then maybe give some examples. And that might work out to 30 minutes, but we'll see. We'll think about it. So let me see if I can get.
I saw that you sent I believe it was their email or Slack. We sent an update with some diagrams, but was that for the CI one or was that for this one? I don't
Oh,
quite
that was for
remember.
the CI one. So I'll get to
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Okay. So that's the CSV conference. So we'll talk, and I sent you a link in the chat on the last year's conference, so you can get a sense of what they did. I mean, how they would put together a talk. So
I'll be looking at that this week for sure.
Okay. So that's in May. I don't know. They'll send more information about the deadlines and so forth. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me go to the next thing here on the schedule. That's that. And then, oh, I don't want to do that yet. Well, yeah, actually, maybe I'll switch over to Ankit. So Ankit, you sent me a message saying that you had more, here's Devansh, that you had more animations.
Yeah, I sent you the Google Drive link of the animations. Like 6 animations are there. So I was struggling to crop them one by one. So I think that actually very there are some online tools, but they are taking a lot of time. So not done with the cropping yet.
Okay. So why don't I tell you? Oh, what were you gonna say?
So I would then search for some software which can crop those animations, the GIFs. You're saying something?
Oh yeah. So I told everyone that I submitted the paper to archive the other day, and so it'll be announced Sunday. It should be announced Sunday evening in North America. So probably Monday morning in India and Europe. I'll send a notification when that happens. Hi, Stefan.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. And so that's been submitted. And then what I did with the animations, instead of putting them as supplemental files, I actually created a repository in Figshare. So this is a repository that it's called Dynamic Demos of Bradenburg Vehicle Collectives. And we're authors on it. And this is the vehicle 2B. I have a video file and a GIF. So I have 2 versions of it. So what I was thinking for the ones that you have is to crop out the terminal and then each one just have like a GIF and an MP4 file, a video file. And then I can take them from that directory and upload them to this stub. And so this has...
you can send me the link of this thing. I can upload it directly over here. If I have the access.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you have you have to have an account on Figshare for that. But yeah, I don't know how it works. But I think I can do it. I can do it for my account. I can see if you want to join Figshare, I can probably set you up on it too. But we'll see.
Okay, so this sounds cool. So yeah, so mainly the thing is to truncate the videos when initially I'm giving commands, and then the terminal appears, the window appears of my platform. So ideally only the platform should be visible instead of the terminal initially, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it.
And if you see this platform, or when the platform appears, it contains rest of it doesn't appear only the platform. Also, there are also some parts of the PC that are visible. So we need to crop those things to make it a very yes.
Yeah, I think the beginning and the end will be cropped. If you watch this video or this GIF, I crop these, and it just crops out.
When the first one, I'd point out certain.
Yeah. So then, if you see it, just look at it, and that's basically the interval that we want. And then we can just do that for those, and please label the files so that we know which vehicle it is, because it's just to keep it straight. And that'll be
Yeah,
good.
so that's already done. So I've labeled them as resting 2A or like moving 2A or something like that.
Yeah, that would
So
work.
they're already there. I'll just truncate them from the initial and last part and send it to you by tomorrow maybe.
Okay, sounds good.
Mhm.
And so yeah, this has a we can cite this as well. So there's a DOI associated with this now. So in the paper, it's cited with a DOI and Figshare. So
Mhm.
it's a permanent it's a permanent archive for this stuff. So that's good.
That's nice.
So
Mhm.
next thing I wanted to get to was I have some more papers to go over, and then we'll get to the CI
Mhm.
abstract.
Yeah.
Or maybe we'll do the CI abstract first. I think that might work better. So Jesse, this is the CI abstract that that's gonna be submitted later today. So this is the version of it that we have now. It's
Oh,
three.
it's going to be submitted today?
Well, today or tomorrow. I mean, it's due the
Okay.
first. But
Oh, yeah. Mixed up which is what. Okay. I will look at that more today, too.
okay, yeah. If you want to do that, I'll wait for you to do it.
Yeah, I'll look at it right after the meeting to go over anything.
Okay, that sounds good. And it's just like the 3 pages here, and then the references. And I think that's probably good. Um, just 1 page. I think 1 page of references, but I think we can fit it in. I can shrink down the font just to be like, just to make it within their
Mm.
requirements here. We go up to 10. Sometimes you can make the references smaller and it fits in better. Yeah, if you're working with page limit, sometimes it's a good thing to have. Like, you have to like play around with you have to play with the rules a little bit. But, so that's the paper, and then what I did with the graphical abstract. Remember we talked about that last week. So this is the graphical abstract, and this is the thing I sent you in Slack. So this is like a diagram of the graphical abstract. So it's basically like a panel diagram where it has like different parts. So these are the shapes, these are the stimuli here, A and B. C and D are the architectures. And then E is like an output or a phenotypic output. And so it's just like they have like the presentation, how they're related, and then the part on the bottom, which is so it's like just a bunch of images that are labeled, and then they're labeled in the paper or in the abstract. So like here, it's like affine perspective, see part A, graphical abstract. That corresponds to this. And so it's described in the extended abstract. And each panel or each part is cited in here. So okay. So I mean, again, that's something if you want to look it over and comment. I'll wait till tomorrow to submit it. So
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so that's that. And next issue here are the papers. So I have some papers again, like I did last week. These are things that I've found in the reading queue that are interesting that I wanted to kind of go over a little bit with everyone to make them aware that they exist. So there are 3 papers here that are kind of around the same theme. So the first paper is this is a paper from 2019. Intersection of motor volumes predicts the outcome of predator-prey interaction. And this is actually a neuroethology paper. This person, Malcolm McIver, he's done a lot of stuff on like robotics and neuroethology. And one of the things he did, I think, for his PhD dissertation is to build a model of an electric fish and build like a model of its electric field relative to its body. So he has these 3D volumes that are like the fish's body, and then this electrical field surrounding the body. And so I don't know if they show that in this paper, but it's pretty interesting. So they kind of go through this paper where they talk about these volumes and how they work to sort of, they work to sort of put the sort of the parameters on the organism's sensory system. So, they have, like, all animals, they have different senses. So, like, we have eyes and we have our arms and legs, and our eyes can see much farther than our arms and legs. And so we can see things way off into the distance, but we can't touch them or do anything like that. We can hear things long distances too, but we can't touch things that we hear. Like if we hear thunder, 10 miles away, we can't reach out and touch it. So you might call it the reach volume, is limited, but our like passive sensory volume, which is hearing and vision, is quite decoupled from that. So you can see and hear things farther away than you can touch them. Now, in some organisms, they have a movement volume, which is how fast can they, how far can they move in a certain amount of time. So it's like if you look at like a ballistic movement for a fish or like your arm, it can move a certain distance in a certain amount of time, and then there's a limit to that distance. So one ballistic movement might go so far in terms of meters. Your arm moves in terms of centimeters so far, and then that's your volume, your reach volume, or the motor volume. Now, the different senses have different volumes because the senses are different in terms of how far their resolution is. So your motor volume is short, but your visual volume is large. And so they do overlap, of course, but then they don't overlap in other areas. And so that's kind of the idea behind this work, is where you have this, they want to understand like where the senses overlap and where there's discontinuity. And it might predict behavior and what's going on in the brain, particularly with respect to like multisensory integration. So like if you're touching something and you see it at the same time, that's more information than just touching it with your eyes closed or just looking at it without touching it. And so those things can affect your, what's going on in the brain as well. And so they talk about the intersection of volumes, the intersection of the volume containing all possible escape trajectories of the fish, and the swept volume of the nymph's attack, the swept volume being the area that they move in a ballistic movement. So they actually, in this case, they're looking at like how far, like the entire range of motion of the fish, where it can go at any given time, versus like one ballistic movement that it can make in one direction to capture prey. And so it's an interesting paradigm because, it's like we don't usually think about it that way. We usually think about the senses as being like, just we can count like stimuli and, but to think about it in terms of this volumetric approach, I think is really interesting. And so they actually have another paper where they talk about how, like the evolution of, or how when life moved on land from the sea, because like vertebrates originally were all living in the oceans, the ancestral form of vertebrates. And when vertebrates started to move on to land, their vision, their visual field, their visual envelope changed dramatically because they needed to be able to see long distances and plan ahead. And so there was this shift in terms of the sensory volumes and in terms of the sensory organs at that time. They have another paper on that topic, but that's not what this is about. This is about prey capture and looking at these motor volumes. So it's a really interesting paper. Let me put a link to the I lost it. All right, well.
You can just put Control Shift T in it.
What is it? Control Shift what?
Control Shift T. T for tattoo.
Here it is. Okay. We just do that too. So let me put this in the chat so that we can go back to it if we want to look up any of these papers. It should be shared with everyone.
It's need to get the access.
Okay, access. So there's a trouble with Google Drive, like it doesn't give you, like access is always often limited.
Yeah, so you just can't copy that link and send it. I have to do this thing. Get shareable link.
Alright. There you go. I think that should be it. So that was the intersection of motor volumes. Then there's another paper that's kind of related. This is more in humans. This is where there are large-scale dissociations between views of objects, scenes, and reachable scale environments in visual cortex. So in this paper, they talk about a similar idea where there's a difference between like visual spatial processing, which is like where you're looking at things and figuring out where they are in space, and object processing. And one of the discontinuities, of course, is where you can basically touch things versus not being able to touch things that you can see. So if you can touch things that are in like your close-up view, that has more information spatially than if you're looking farther away and doing that. So they actually talk a lot about this in the paper. They call it reachable scale environments. And so one example of a reachable scale environment would be a work table where you build something, or a countertop where you make a meal. And so those are, not like landscapes, which are like farther away, but they're things where you're manipulating objects and in space. And so they kind of go over the details of this, where you have these two different types of, types of scenes where, it could be you have just objects that are not in a reach space. So you have isolated objects like a cup. You have reach spaces, which are like a kitchen sink or like a dinner table where you're eating, or, some other area where you're working. And then a scene, which is like you're looking down a hallway, or if you're looking at a room from afar and you're not touching anything. So those are the things. And they show that like there are different areas of visual cortex that are active in each of these cases. And so this is, I think, fMRI data that they're using, and they have, different degrees of preference for different areas, for different types of these conditions. So for objects, for reach spaces, and for scenes. And they all have different sort of visuospatial representations in the brain. And this is in humans, so this is a human brain. So they did a couple of experiments, and they looked at different parts of the visual processing. So they have different regions of interest that they're looking at here. And then the results, of course, vary by region of interest, which is just like an area of the brain. Like this is superior parietal, this is occipital parietal, and this is ventral. So these different areas of visual cortex. So this is an interesting paper, and it kind of relates to the one that we talked about previously, which is where they do this in animals and they construct this volume. In this case, they're just presenting an environment to the person and they're doing neuroimaging. So that's that paper, and you can look at it for more detail. I did it again. Okay, now alright, this is the last paper, so if I close out of this afterwards, that's fine.
Yeah.
Let's see. This one, selectivity to approaching motion. So the third paper is so this one is selectivity to approaching motion and retinal inputs to the dorsal visual pathway. So this one actually is a little bit different. This one has we're talking about detecting approaching motion. So this is actually something close to what we're talking about with Bradenburg vehicles. So with Bradenburg vehicles, you have, there's the vehicle is moving towards stimuli and away from stimuli, and it's using this sort of, it's using the stimuli as a way to like measure where it's going, where it's been. I mean, there's a sort of like way. Some of the modeling is involving like just being attracted or repulsed by the light, say, a light source. But there's also this aspect of tracking it in terms of where it is in your environment. And there's been a lot of work on things called place cells, which actually there's in the hippocampus, there are different types of cells. They call them place cells, and then there are also grid cells. The place cells are the type of cells that track like places in space. So place cells will track things in space where you are with respect to different locations. And so there is that sort of map that's built in the hippocampus. But your visual system is also involved in this detection of motion and sort of figuring out where you are in space. And so they report here that the detection of approaching motion begins in the earliest stages of visual processing in primates. So this is like the early processing, like in what they call V1, which is the place where your brain is processing blobs. It's it's picking out the basic patterns of the visual scene, and so it's picking out, like in time, it's picking out where you are relative to something moving, and so that information is ultimately integrated with what's going on in the hippocampus. So there's this very complex model being built of objects and then where they're moving and where you are. And so they further indicate, or wait a minute. So several ganglion cell types, the retinal output neurons, show selectivity to approaching motion. So this is actually in the eye, ganglion cell types. Synaptic current recordings from these cells further reveal that this preference for approaching motion arises in the interplay between presynaptic, excitatory, and inhibitory circuit elements. So again, like we talk about this in Bradenburg vehicles, we talk about like different, if you think about in the paper, table 2, and we think about like the different configurations of the nervous system and how it represents like an emotion and how it's either excitatory or inhibitory. And that sort of, you see that in this kind of system as well, where you have, certain configurations of the visual system, and they contribute to this ability to detect oncoming motion and track it and things like that. So this further indicates that elementary computations that detect approaching motion begin early in the visual stream of primates. And so they kind of go on in this paper, they discuss, it's a very short introduction, but they do this series of experiments in macaque and monkey retina, and they find that the ganglion cells, or they're trying to determine whether the ganglion cells show a preference for approaching motion. So, is there a preference for something that's moving towards them or away from them or what? And so, without going too much further into this, that they do have, they're able to sort of build a model of this, where the cells are active or prefer certain types of movement over others. And it's like, this is where the processing happens. So, in Bradenberg's book, he talks about this in terms of basic emotion. But in the eyeball, of course, in the retina, we're not talking about emotion. We're just talking about detecting emotion and encoding that information. So I think it's an interesting kind of different look at that. They do their experiments. They have 5 primate ganglion cell types show preference for approaching textures. So they're actually able to show that when you have this texture here that's looming, like if you present it like far away in the visual field, and then you bring this pattern forward, there's a different response than if you keep it static in the back, way in the back, or if it recedes from the field of view. So there are differences in terms of how this is presented in space, this pattern, and there's a distinct neural signature of that. Approach motion selectivity predicted from nonlinear subunits. And you have some nice graphs results here. And so I mean, it's an interesting paper. They also test moving rings, and they want to see if there's a difference for things like rings instead of patterns. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that they did here, and contributions of circuit nonlinearities to visual coding. So again, they're basically arguing that it's a sort of a regulatory system that's involved in this. So, I mean, it's a different take on the sort of things that Bradenberg was talking about. So if you're interested in that paper, we have that. So those are the papers for this week. And again, I think I put that in the chat. So if you're interested in following up on that, you may. I wanted to stop and ask if anyone had any questions. We had people coming at different times. So maybe if you have any comments or news that you want to mention.
I just wanted to clarify on that the video thing. Do I need to put that in the GIF format or MP4 format?
We could do. I was thinking of doing both. So we could have the MP4 and the GIF for each one, so people could download it in either format.
Okay. So I would actually just crop the MP4 file and then convert that to GIF.
Yeah, that would probably be the easiest way to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool then.
Yeah.
And also we were about to you were about to share something for the OHBM conference. So do you have any update on that? We submitted that.
I haven't gotten any updates on the OHBM conference. About the slide deck. Okay, so I haven't made that yet. I said that I would make a uniform slide deck. Why don't we do that next week? I don't know if you guys have thought about it yet, really, but we'll do that next week.
Mainly because he said that the deadline for that conference was delayed, so that's why maybe the results are not coming or have not come yet.
Oh well, the abstract deadline was delayed, but not the actual conference. So the conference is on the 20th. So, but what I was saying is that I want to put together a uniform slide presentation. Actually, what you can do is if you have a slide, or you can. I mean, I guess you can work on the slides independently, and then we can put them together later. Because at least have a plan of the final slide, and then we can
put our parts, or just if we have the plan, like the overall plan of the whole group, and then we can like
Yeah.
contribute our parts.
All right. I'll do that next week. I'll bring the PPT file. I'll put in like the different parts. Like maybe what I'll do is I'll create a slide. Like I'll create a list, and then I'll have open slides, and then people can either make it on their own or put it in there. We'll put it in like a couple days before. I don't know what the nearest Saturday is to that deadline. It's probably like
So just this would be to make sure that people know that what's the like the oral narrative must be uniform. Otherwise, that would be much of a problem.
yeah. Let me make that up, and then so I'll make like a plan, just like a list of what we plan to do, and then I'll send it out to everyone. That's a good way to do it, and maybe I'll just do it like asynchronously. So the 20th is a Thursday, so we have 2 sessions to hash it out, 8th and the 15th. So next week we'll do. Well, I'll send it out this week, and then next week we'll talk about it, and then the 15th we'll finalize it. And again, it's like think about how you might best present your project visually, like. For Ankit and Stefan and then Z, how would you present this visually? Is this something that you have a good visual summary of, and that would just consist of some of your figures from the paper, or maybe some other things you might want to add, but just something that summarizes what you have.
Yeah. So, what is the focus of this presentation? What do you want to present? Just a platform or? What's our idea? So, if you could elaborate on that.
I think just a summary of the platform.
Just the platform, right?
Yeah, just the platform. Because they'll be able to read the paper for more details.
Cool. So, fine enough.
Yeah. Stefan or Devansh, do you have anything to add or?
Yeah, I will try to summarize my project in a diagram, which I'll put together probably the next week.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll do this way.
That sounds good. Thank you.
All right. And so, I have this recordings already, so just need to write some stuff about what's like how the platform is working and what are the equations that are there. Just that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Devansh, do you have anything to add? All right. So Jesse, we mentioned earlier today, I guess, about the Tristan paper.
Yes.
You said that you weren't really ready, but you want to maybe have a discussion about it.
Yeah. We could talk briefly about active inference, but I don't think I'm in this good shape to have an in-depth, thorough, 20-minute talk about it by any means, to be honest.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm not it might be hard for me to I don't think I can share any slides on my situation right now.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to do that or just sort of have an open discussion about active inference.
Well, actually, if you have your slides, I can go through some of them and then ask questions. If that's something, yeah.
Yeah. We can try that.
Okay.
Very active inference freestyle.
Yeah, it's I don't know how it's a pretty complex topic, so it's 20 minutes isn't really going to be enough to like go comprehensively over it, but I think if we have the slides.
Yeah.
I guess I would ask, is anybody here actually familiar with active inference, like or call person's free energy principle stuff on their own? I'm not sure. Okay, I didn't think so.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Fine.
I'm sorry. Were you getting the slides?
Oh, I don't think I have the link. Do you have the link to your slide deck? Actually, you could put that in the chat, and I could open it here on this side, on this end.
Yeah, or the ones that I think you sent ones in Slack.
Yeah.
I'll send those too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also, is there any update on that FQX? I think I actually checked that thing.
Oh. Well, I think that's yeah. I've put that aside for a while, but I'm going to come back to it because I had so many other things going on. But yeah, I'll come back to it. Maybe next week we'll talk more about it. But
so
yeah, it's still
30th of March, maybe, right?
It's like the 16th, so it's a little bit earlier than the deadline for like the Twitter conference. But it's coming up, but we'll work through it. Yeah, we'll have to make a push at the end towards the deadline. So yeah. Yeah.
So I can paste this.
There we go.
I think those are the latest links or slides.
Yeah, it looks like it. Okay, so it's opening up. All right, now let me share my screen. I'll share my screen on this end, and we'll do it. So, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we have the. This is Jesse's presentation. It's going to ask me for my login and password for this. Let me see, I can probably do it. It's just going to let me into this thing. All right, so yeah, this is Jesse's presentation on the Tristan free energy principle, and they did this thing with active inference.
Yeah, I would introduce it by saying what inspired this was I've heard about the free energy principle before. I actually was in a discussion group about it some months ago, maybe over a year ago, with it actually cropped up as part of excuse me. It came about as a discussion group that was associated with a quirky project / startup called Mindfire Global. I don't know if any of you have heard about it, but Mindfire Global is a startup that originally is based in, I think, Switzerland. And I forgot the name of the guy who founded it, but he's sort of a neuroscience guy who wanted to have very, his goal was to kind of have very biologically described, quote-unquote, human-level artificial intelligence. And originally, Mindfire was this the idea was to bring many different scholars at different levels together and focusing on that and kind of bring them together and have these like conferences and then do things with what outcomes from the conference and so on and so forth. But apparently that only happened one time. There was supposed to be a number of like quote unquote missions where people got together to look at specific aspects of how to do the goal of getting towards quote human level AI. And there were different, amounts of interest and whatnot in that from the people there. So I was applying to the second mission for that, which, as far as I can tell, never actually happened because startups and plans like that sometimes don't work out. But in the process of all of that, one of the discussions was Carl Friston's free energy principle and active inference. So it's a bit of that's how I came into it, and there were a number of different people trying to figure out how to talk about it. It's an interesting concept, and it's a challenging one because it is a principle at best, and it's not something that can be proven or disproven. And I believe Carl Friston basically has stated this very openly. So it's kind of a hey, I have an idea that's pretty somewhat logical about how biological systems organize themselves, and will here's how I think it works, and then I and looking at my developments for this specific discussion, the discussion originated from a paper that had a very interesting title. The title was either natural selection for natural gradient or natural gradient for, by natural selection. Natural selection finds natural gradients. And so in the most broad sense, is the slides available yet?
It's still loading. Oh, here we go. It's finally coming up, I think. This is taking a long time. Okay.
Just look at my own slides here in a moment.
There we go. And now it just brings me to this thing, but I think I can get it.
Oh, well.
Well, I can get them from here. Yeah, they're right here.
I kind of boiled down the main point of the paper. Yeah. So that's kind of basic title. If you look at the next slide is basically what the paper looks like. It's a fairly new paper on arXiv, and it's I don't think it's I'm not sure if it's basically a preprint at this point. Like I think it's fairly new. The next slide was going to be my original overview for the paper, and I think I might do that. However, what I'm learning is, I think any discussion about the fluidity principle seems to have quite a bit of like you can't if you kind of have some context for it, you can basically say, hey, free energy principle and active inference has to do with how a biological system organizes itself and kind of shifts between different states or states of beliefs or states of action or whatnot. And you can say that, and that's like, okay, that's great. But to have a more thorough discussion, there's a lot that goes into it. And I'm realizing that as I tried to make this original presentation for this specific paper, and you can look at the presentation overview on the next slide, this is what I was thinking of. Like when I first read the paper, I'm like, all right, this would be a good way to talk about it. But in doing so, I'm not presented, so to say. I'm first in before. and I've been looking at different ways that he speaks about his own work, and other people comment about it too. I feel like, for myself in particular, I would like to have, like, if I gave the presentation as I originally intended to, I feel like if I was watching the presentation, I would rather, and this is how I am, but I admit, I would rather have more focus on the fundamental ideas of what the free energy principle is, and then ultimately look at what it's trying to do with the paper. And I can say what that is in a very limited and kind of basic sense now, but what that really is just, I feel like this paper and a number of the papers I've seen about active frequency and free energy principle tend to go back to what I was saying about how the principle is a principle and not something to be proven or not. So it's more a bunch of different, there are many different takes on, hey, here's a principle in theory, well, not in theory, but in principle, I suppose. Here's a concept, and does it really fit with this phenomenon that I'm trying to observe? And if so, how much? And one of the discussions that came up with some of, I don't know, colleagues or friends or whatever you like to say about it is, there's a particular limit to, similar to, maybe you could draw an analogy to the tornado vehicles in that, when you're making it goes to how much do you want to draw a comparison to something else, as in, oh, our brain vehicles demonstrate emotions. It's like, well, is that emotion? Is that something you can really? Is that more matching to a concept of what an emotion is versus and a demonstrated behavior, or can you get, like, how empirical can you really get about that? So I think that's the general theme for talking about a lot of in a more practical sense, what papers about the free energy principle seem to come down to. Looking at this paper specifically, and the next slide in the discussion, I basically identified the main point of the paper as, our work suggests that biological agents approximate natural gradient descent on free energy per state estimation. So basically he's saying, this paper, I think, is a slightly more involved and direct assertion that natural gradient is very much in line with how natural selection has shaped transitions between states or belief states or state estimation. And what does that really mean? I don't quite know how to say that other than, hey, he's saying natural gradient descent fits really well with the energy principle. And there's quite a bit that could be said along those lines, but I don't feel comfortable going much further at this time. You can see in the outline in the next, you don't necessarily have to go to the next couple slides, but like you can see, I would start breaking down what is the free energy principle itself, what is active inference, and gradient descent, and then trying to flesh that out in the paper as he's getting to those things as they apply to gradient descent. Let's see if there's anything particularly interesting to talk about. One thing that in our paper, I think that's the slide I'm looking at too. The free energy principle is interesting in a broad sense about homeostasis and allostasis, sort of the process of the regulation. We talked about that. I mentioned the medium and the message in that section because the active component of active inference kind of has to do with what I would consider, I don't know if progressive is the right word, but it sort of has to do with what we talked about regarding embodied cognition in the paper. And active kind of has to do with, a traditional form of cognition, or how the brain operates is sort of a passive receptive organ, just constantly it just receives information from the senses and calculates, and then the brain, and that is intelligence. The intelligence and cognition is the calculation of passive inputs from the sensory environment. That's sort of the classic, somewhat detached, very heady view of cognition and such. And it's obviously a bit, simplistic. And embodied cognition is sort of a step towards the inherently emergent or inherently complex nature of an agent and how it is engaging with the world. So active inference kind of, if we skip ahead to a couple slides before I talk about active inference, there's the diagram. Yeah, that one. So active inference, in a very simple terms, is, you kind of see, if you look at the green and then going on top to sensory states and internal states, like that's sort of the, if you will, in my own words, like that's sort of a passive receptive part of it. Going in, and then active inference is how there's an output that affects external states outside of the agent, the molecular blanket. And what I feel like I have some interesting, and I don't know if I kind of want to say at this point, I have some ideas that I'm very interested to explore how match with what Tristan says. And I don't quite know what Tristan says about this yet, but if you know, Bradley, or anybody else, I would open this for a question. If I was sort of just a participant in this conversation too, I'd say, I don't know where about, this would be like the thing I close on here, basically, but I'm very curious how Tristan would address the sort of the difference between an expectation, like if you have an expectation or a bias in your perspective, like a very simple example would be, you hear a noise and you think, okay, what is the noise? Is it a twig breaking? I'm in the jungle. Is that twig, just a harmless sound, or is that twig a lion or a tiger that's approaching a corner? And there's what I'm getting is, if you have a bias towards believing that phenomenon is deadly, a threat, and you have a reaction, that's sort of a premeditated expectation to have about the situation. And if that's your default reaction, there's an inherent, it activates your nervous system and your responses to react a certain way. And so what I'm curious about is, does Tristan see that as a development of active inference, as in getting to a state where, okay, to make all of our processing faster, we have very specific biases and expectations? Or does he see that as, I guess, how fixed does he see those expectations being? And what motivates or modulates them? So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what he thinks necessarily, but I mean, from this diagram, you can see that the internal state is, there's no real differentiation between an internal state that's, say, constructed from sensory states and an internal state that's sort of innate. So like, with in terms of like fear conditioning, you learn maybe one thing that's very like threatening in this from a sensory state, and there's a response to that, and that guides your active state. And sometimes that can be associated with things that aren't really deadly, but it's already sort of there, and the new sensory information can't really override that. Whereas opposed to some other internal states where the sensory states sort of will allow you to infer something and build like something that you can make actionable. Like if you only get like partial information about a pattern, for example, you can, sort of infer what the rest of the pattern is and then have an actionable state, but that might actually be wrong because you're using your inference to guide you instead of, a full sampling of the sensory space. So there are a lot of like vagaries in this internal state. I think it's important to realize that when people say it's an internal state, it could be a lot of, they're very complex versions of that. And so sensory states will play a role, will contribute to that, but there are different ways that the nervous system can sample that information and then put it into an active state. So, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. And then in terms of finding like an optimal state, you might find an optimal state maybe for that context, but like, it might not be full, globally optimal. Like if I think that like rustling in the bushes is a snake, I'll always run away. It'll just be an automatic impulse. But there might actually be some, maybe it's not a snake, maybe it's something good in the bushes. But we don't. That's the problem with sort of internal states. Sometimes the override are, they may be good for one context, but not good globally. So.
Yeah. And I guess I'm curious to learn more if Tristan gets to a place where he can more specifically identify, like, when I think internal states, I know conceptually what that is for me in a semi-cognitive sense.
Yeah.
But in reality, I don't think there's like a part of your brain that just like, hey, here's a set of internal states to choose from. Like it's not quite as, I don't think there's obviously empirical inabilities or I guess it might be harder to do that. And I think that's like going back to my original point about many of the things I've seen about Tristan's work in the sense of okay, here's a situation, how does it apply to the principle or not?
Yeah.
And, that's okay, but I feel like in short, it's kind of a riddle and an enigma and a quagmire, and it's useful in a very particular conceptual sense, and it is interesting, and I'm curious about it. But it's also sort of is it sort of a similar black box issue because we don't really know how internal states work.
Yeah.
Or do we? So I don't know. Anyway,
yeah.
I think I'll probably leave it at that because we're going over time, and I appreciate people attempting to listen to what I was saying. So, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we talked about gradient descent, but that's getting into another can of worms. And then your main point is that biological agents approximate natural gradient descent on free energy for state estimation. So we were kind of talking about that where you have to, then your internal state is sort of going down this gradient descent, and the internal state can maybe be locally optimal or globally optimal, but probably locally optimal in many cases. But that's something that we don't really know. Like it's unfounded because the theory is kind of the principle's out there, but like we don't know how it really works. And so I think this is like the rest of Jesse's slides, but I think that's a good summary. I think that's a good summary. And we can talk more about it informally, in subsequent weeks if you want. Maybe we can talk about it Monday a little bit. I can, bring up the video and we can maybe talk about it a bit. But I think it's definitely worth teasing out a bit more and getting some more perspectives. So if
it was up to me, I would probably come back to this, and I feel like to have a good discussion, it would ultimately be, here's a number of Tristan's papers or his general concepts. It's like how he's fleshing it out, because I feel like it's some like kind of like some aspects of complexity stuff. You kind of have to compare it, because you can't really point at it directly. So you can say here from this angle, from this angle, from this angle, and go from there. I could see myself over time doing more of that. But I mean, you know, yeah. So
well,
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think this is a good start, and I think it's important to think that he's trying to come up with like sort of a global or universal rule or universal principle, and yet it's very hard to get there, and that's maybe one of the takeaways from this. So yeah, thank you very much, Jesse, for that. That's very interesting, and so why don't we wrap it up for this week? Do you have anyone have any other comments or questions before we go?
Yeah, I have to say something. Like in the mail, you have said if we promote it on social media or among our prayers, like you are talking about the papers. So
yeah,
I was curious. Like once we have the preprint, like we should promote it on LinkedIn or something like that, so that more number of people go through that.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea to promote the information on LinkedIn or on Twitter or wherever we like to go. I just like send out a link and kind of say a little bit about it, and then, people will see it and maybe read it. The idea is to get it out there as widely as possible so that people can see it and notice it, and then maybe we'll get some feedback. Maybe people will be interested in knowing more, attending our Twitter conference talk and so forth.
Yeah, cool. So once we have the, like you said that that link will be available a day after, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Once
as soon as I get, I think like tomorrow night I'll get the link and then I'll send it to everyone, and then you can distribute it, because it'll be announced publicly. They release them publicly at a certain time of day. And
Oh yeah, we won't know. Like we'll know. I guess we're still waiting to see if we get accepted, right? And then like maybe get like a time slot after that.
oh, for the conference, we have to get the time slot. I mean, I think we'll be accepted, but they'll schedule it, and then it's going to be like, there'll be a time when it's put online, but then it'll be there. Yeah.
I realize I might be traveling that day, but I could, have some input or pre-planned input or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's probably asynchronous, because people they'll comment right then, but like it might be later on that people will comment too.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Stefan or Devansh, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Jesse. At the time, I don't have any comments. I must probably read something upon the topic.
Okay.
Well, you're welcome. That's pretty much exactly how I still feel as well. So.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for attending, everyone, and look forward to next week. I'll send out an email about the paper and then next week's meeting, and talk to you then.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Don't get sick.
Yeah.
Bye.